Hello, I'm Chrissy Seaton and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing on with the Psalms, and it's Psalm 137, and it begins by saying by the rivers of Babylon, and you may have even heard that phrase associated with a song that was quite popular some years ago. So I've chosen this psalm because I think there are so many things in it that are pertinent to all mankind, not just the Jews. And at this time in history, I think it's a good opportunity for us just to think carefully about some things, and also the whys and the wherefores. So that's why I've been led to this psalm. So it's Psalm 137, and we want to look at the meaning of it. And it's also to remind you about this psalm is about the time when the Jews were in exile. It says the prophetic sorrow of the exile is portrayed in this psalm, and it also tells all of us, never forget Jerusalem. Never forget it. Always keep it on our mind. And in this day and time across the world, it's always pertinent for us to keep Jerusalem in our prayers, keep Israel in our prayers. So let's start. So this intense mourning for this once joyous nation it's now covered in this exile, this gloom and doom, and remembering the former glory of Zion, their previous former glory, and now they've got to compare this to their present situation and degradation on foreign soil. So they've been plucked out of their home, so to speak, and put in a foreign place, and now everything has changed. Everything that they knew and were accustomed to before is now changed. So let's take a look at each verse now. Now, again, some of you may have different translations or using different versions or editions of the Psalms. So there'll be odd words that are different or phrasing or something. But I'm going right to the Jewish version, and it has the interlinear translation. So there's Hebrew and there's English. So this is as close as we can get to the actual real meaning of it all. So it goes on and says that in verse 1 it says by the rivers of Babylon. That's the very thing that starts off in verse 1. Now, according to this may specifically refer to the main waterway of Babylon, which was the Euphrates River. So that's sort of just a little bit of geography there, so you get your head around that. Now, this river added to the terrible devastation that was coming upon the Jews, because it said that this specifically where they were previously in Zion, their water was pure, crystal, sweet, clean, just delicious. But now, out of their homeland, the drinking water that they've got is not so. It's now they have to begin to drink muddy water. It's unsanitary. So the very water that they were drinking, regardless of anything else, is now, it's a health risk for them as well. It's an unsanitary river. Now it says the unhealthy waters of the river killed more Jews than did all the soldiers of Nebuchadnezzar's, the ruler of Babylon. So the actual water killed more than the Nebuchadnezzar did. So that's just something to additional information to wrap our head around, really. It goes on and says that, the phrase "we sat." Now, the comments that this psalm refers not only to the beginning of the exile, but to the entire Jewish sojourn in Babylon during the decades that followed the destruction of the temple, that is. He notes that the Jews did not suffer there. This is indicated by the word "we settled" and by the words of the prophet. Now, there's a reference here to Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 5. Build houses and settle, plant gardens and eat their produce. And that's in that verse. The Jews wept not as the result of oppression, but when annexation represented a new divine kindness in Israel. So we're going on here now. I beg your pardon. The Jews wept not as a result of the oppression, but when we remember Zion. Again, if you're familiar with that song, you'll almost know this. The material benefits enjoyed by the Jews in Babylon did not console them when they recalled Zion in ruins. Although we spent 70 years in Babylon, we still cry when we recall Zion. Now it goes on, the phrase, and also wept. Now, this implies that others wept along with the captives. It describes how the unhealthy waters of the river took a terrible toll among the hapless Jewish captives, and the Jews died. Now, Nebuchadnezzar and his royal entourage happily surveyed the morbid spectacle from pleasure boats floating in on the river. I mean, you just can't believe that, can you? I mean, you can't get your head around it. Now, it goes on and says that the princes and the nobles of Judea were stripped naked and shackled in iron chains on the riverbanks. When Nebuchadnezzar noticed them, he explained, "Why are these captives walking around so easily? Why do they not carry heavy loads?" So immediately the captives were loaded with staggering burdens that bent their backs permanently. The wail of the tormented exiles rose up of the tormented exiles rose up to heaven until God took pity and cried with them. God wept and we also wept. Now it goes on and says that we cried again. That is, our tears never ceased. Even if we paused briefly, we immediately cried again. So, we've all been in a situation like that when something has so saddened us or disadvantaged us or whatever. You cry and you think, "Oh, I'll be all right now. I'm okay." And then a few minutes later, you just start crying again. It's so debilitatingly sad, and you feel so helpless. I'm sure you can recall times that's happened to you personally. Now it goes on here with the phrase and says that when we remembered Zion. Now, musical instruments remained silent in Babylon, proved that Zion was still alive for them. They carried Jerusalem in their hearts. Its memory was not destroyed. It was Babylonia then at the zenith of its power that was destined to die. So, Babylon is now on the top card on the deck, but it's not going to be there for long, It goes on then and comes into verse 2 where it says, "We hung our lyres on the willows that grow in abundance on the riverbanks, in the hope that they would be hidden from the enemy of the branches." Now, why is this so? Well, First of all, these lyres were not ordinary instruments, but sacred ones used by the Levites in the temple service previously. So that was before the exile, of course. Now, the people had not treated such holy articles with proper respect at that time in the temple. But now in exile, they repented. Therefore, they did not irreverently place the lyres on the ground. Rather, they reverently hung them on the willow branches of the trees. Now, we hung our lyres. Now, Nebuchadnezzar insisted that the captives play for him in his court while they ate. The captive Jews hid their instruments in the willows and said to one another, "It is not enough that we caused the destruction of God's temple. Must we now sing and play music for his enemies," meaning for God's enemies? For these are, now chapter 3 starts off and says, verse 3, I beg your pardon, for there our captors requested words of song from us. So as the Jews sat and wept, their captors approached and commanded them, "Arise, sing joyous songs to our idols." Now, the Jews replied, "If only we had sung songs of praise to God while we were in our homeland, we never would have been exiled from our native soil. How can we now sing before strange idols?" So whereas previously they were singing and playing for Hashem, now they've been asked to do this for idols. So the phrase with our lyres playing joyous music. Now Radak maintains that this refers to the lyres of the previous verse, which are called from the root word and hanging, because the Jews had hung them on the willows. Now, alternatively, Radak relates that the weeping, i.e. our cruel captors, demand that instead of our weeping, we should display joy. So it goes on and explains, when we read these verses and just read the verses and don't spend some time thinking about it, we miss some of those hidden gems within the words and the phrases, the image it paints. And that's why it's important to have if you're going to look at the Psalms and say them, and I mean they are prayers, they're songs of praise, we need to really know what they mean. What's this historically referring to, so to speak? So let's go on. Now it says that the Jews refused to sing the songs before the idols. Their captors were infuriated. Oh, I'm sure they would. And it says they slew multitudes of Jews and piled their corpses in mounds. Nevertheless, despite our mounds of dead victims, we rejoiced over our decision to resist singing to their idols. Now, just put that in context of life as we know it. Imagine us being put in that situation. Boggles the mind, doesn't it? Now it goes on. It says here, furthermore, "Sing for us from Zion's song." Now the captors demanded, "You Jews used to sing wonderful things about your homeland Zion. Out of Zion, consummation of beauty, God's appeared. Now we demand that you forget Zion and accept Babylon as your homeland and sing to Babylon the same praise you once sent to Zion." Now, we come up to verse 4 now, and it says, "How can we sing the song of Hashem upon the alien's soil?" And not to mention it was, idolatrous. "How can we praise foreign idols with the very songs with which we once sanctified God?" When Nebuchadnezzar saw the renowned Levite singers who once sang in the temple, he demanded that they serenade him as he feasted merrily over his victory. Without any hesitation, the Levites hung their precious musical instruments on the trees, the willows, and deliberately mutilated their fingers. Now, just so they hung their instruments on the branches of the willow tree. Then on top of that, they then injured, damaged, mutilated deliberately their fingers, and making it impossible for them to play the stringed instrument. Now let me just think, if you play a stringed instrument like a violin, a guitar or whatever, it wouldn't matter whether you're right or left-handed, because you can restring violins for a left-hander, etc. But you've only got to have a band-aid on one of your fingers, and that affects how you play. Particularly an instrument like a violin or any of those finely tuned, You might be able to fudge it with a guitar, but with a violin, your hands are it's important that they're not injured in any way. So they certainly, and the laws would have been like that in sense of their delicate sound and the precision it would have been to play them. So, with a good hand. But now they're going to make sure that can't happen. So they deliberately mutilated their fingers, making it impossible for them to play those stringed instruments. Thus, they did not flatly refuse to play for Nebuchadnezzar, but declared, "How can we sing the song of Hashem? We cannot make any more music with these crippled hands." Verse 5 goes on and says, "I will forget you, if I forget you, O Jerusalem." Now, many laws are derived from this requirement that Jerusalem be foremost in our memories. They are formulated under the heading of remembrance of the destruction. Now, among them are, for instance, if someone, it says here, if they were plastering their home, replastering, they should leave a little tiny area not done, not replastered or remodeled, just as a memory of the destruction of Jerusalem. And so Jews often do that, they'll leave a little section there. Doesn't necessarily apply to us as Gentiles, but it's interesting to understand this, isn't it? And so if a woman adorns herself, she should omit some of her ornaments as a memorial to Jerusalem. When the temple was destroyed, many Jews began to deprive themselves of meat and wine as tokens of mourning. Joshua asked them why, and they answered, "How can we eat meat that was once placed in the temple altar, or drink wine that was once poured on the altar?" He told them, in that case, this is interesting, there's an interesting lesson here. He said, in that case, don't eat figs or grapes, because they were brought to the temple as first fruits. Don't eat bread, because bread was used in the temple service. They did not answer. So it would have stumped them a little bit, that, wouldn't it? Joshua then concluded that it was wrong not to grieve, but it is wrong to grieve excessively. Now, I want you to hang on to that thought, because that applies to many things. Not just the grieving of the temple, but that flows on. When someone dies or you might lose a job or something, then certainly you're going to grieve for that. That's normal. That's perfectly normal and understandable, that you will have some grieving processes, or you may, look, if your house was burnt down or you were flooded, in Queensland there's been all sorts of houses flooded and everything in areas, low-lying areas. You grieve for that because you've lost things, memories, photos. That grief is part of recovery. However, excessive grieving beyond what is reasonable is not good. It's not good for us, and it's not good in terms of we've got to get our attention back on Hashem. So he says, but it is wrong to grieve excessively. Now, sages enacted legislation to memorialise the destruction of the temple. They did not impose restrictions that most people cannot obey. So, they knew what they were doing. They knew about reasonability. Now, it says here, let my right hand forget, meaning its skill. It is the right hand that strums the strings of musical instruments. The phrase, its skill, does not appear in the text but is implied. So, we do know now there are left-handed people, but in general, they're speaking. Now, no man can think of functioning without the use of his right hand, or let's say if you're left-handed, that would be your normal hand. And it is inconceivable that he would forget it. It is equally impossible for us to forget Jerusalem. So indeed, for the Jew to forget Jerusalem would be tantamount to forgetting God. For God is always at our right hand. And chapter 16, verse 8 states that I have set Hashem before me always, because he is at my right hand, I shall not falter. That's interesting. Now, verse number 6, let's get on with that. It says, let my tongue adhere to my palate if I fail to recall you. Now, if I speak of other things but fail to mention the calamity of the temple's destruction, let my tongue be stilled and let it sing no more. Now, it is my obligation to recall Jerusalem and to pray for her in my every supplication. If any of you have been to Israel, if you've been to Israel, you would have gone to Jerusalem. And the Western Wall there is the most holy place. But, you can't help but... there's something surreal when you touch that wall and you start thinking about all the history associated with this, all that's happened. It's that tangible thing to touch. It does things to you. And I know I've mentioned this before, but while I'm at this point, I'm just going to reiterate. At this time, Israel is going through real difficulties at this time, as it has done in the past. But, this is happening in our time, a lot of troubles at the moment that aren't Israel's fault. And there's a lot of talk and discussion about this amongst people who think they understand everything. And a lot of people say some outrageous things, so the Jews brought this all on themselves, this, that, and the other. It just shocks me what comes out of the mouths of people who I believed should have known better. And so I say, so tell me, you've been to Israel, have you? When were you last there? When were you in Israel? Oh, no, I've never been there, but I read a lot. I can't help myself. Heaven forbid. Forgive me, Hashem. I say, well, with all due respects, madam or sir, you haven't got a clue what you're talking about. So, let's move on. Now, in this, if I fail to elevate, and it goes on and says, it is my obligation to recall Jerusalem and to pray for her in my every supplication. So we should be remembering Israel every time we pray. If I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my foremost joy, no matter what the occasion of personal joy, the memory of Jerusalem must come first. And, when I'm praying, somehow or other, I just picture I can see myself when I was there at the wall. It's like, I can't describe it. Now, this is interesting. The customs, we're going on, it says, the customs that a bridegroom places ashes upon his head before the marriage ceremony, and following that, the custom that a glass is broken after the wedding ceremony, and we've all seen videos of that, in memory of Jerusalem, and it's derived from that verse. So it's derived from that verse, let my tongue adhere to my palate if I fail to recall you, if I fail to elevate Jerusalem above my foremost joy. So there you go. Now we're going on, we're coming towards the end of this video. We're looking now at verse 7, and it says, remember Hashem for the offspring of Edom, the day of Jerusalem. Now the day of Jerusalem is the day of its destruction. If we never forget the destruction, then you, God, should not forget those who carried it out. So we won't forget, but we know Hashem's going to make sure the others that caused the destruction aren't overlooked. Now, for those who say destroy, destroy to its very foundation, the translation follows, and Rabbi Hirsch renders it, strip it, evacuate it, and lay it bare. Pretty direct words, aren't they? Jerusalem relates that the disciples ask Rabbi Eliezer, are the latter generation who lived in the era of the Second Temple better than the earlier generation of the First Temple? Now, this is a very important point here. Now, Rabbi Eliezer replied, you may resolve your questions by observing the testimony offered by the temple itself. And this is important. The first temple was not completely destroyed. The Babylonians merely burnt the roof, leaving the walls intact. The second temple, however, was razed to its very foundation. The fact that the destruction of the second temple was more extensive proves that the people's iniquity was more extensive. That's interesting. Now we come on to second last verse now. Verse 8, O violated daughters of Babylon, it says. Now, even as Babylonia enjoyed the zenith of its power, the psalmist foretells of the destruction of Babylon, for this powerful nation was destined to be conquered and devastated by Cyrus the Persian and Darius the Mede. And you would, if you're history buffs, you would have probably learnt that at school at some stage. Now, it goes on now and says, I'm going to read this out. Praiseworthy is he who repays you in accordance with the manner that you treated us. Now, this is from Isaiah chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. Now, it provides a vivid prophetic description of the future destruction of Babylon. I will rise up against them, the words of Hashem, master of legions, and I will cut off for Babylonia name and remnant, child and grandchild, says Hashem. I will sweep it clean with the broom of destruction, the words of Hashem, master of legions. Now, that is something you have to kind of read more than once to absorb the actual gravity and depth of those words. So let's go on now to the final verse 9. Now it says, praiseworthy is he who will clutch and dash your infants against the rock. Now the psalmist tells Babylon that she will suffer in the same measure she caused Israel to suffer. So that's what it's saying. Thus, her suffering, Babylon, will be, in a sense, self-inflicted. Very interesting, this. The conqueror of Babylon will hate her and torment her cruelly, exactly as she hated and tormented Israel. I'm going to leave that as it is and let you ponder on it. It tells us in no uncertain terms that what will happen, that Israel will ultimately be prevail and be saved and restored. it's going, what happens in the goings on and how people talk about Israel and the Jews, that's all going to end soon. I think we are in the times, the prelude to seeing some of the enemies of Israel and the Jewish people get their, what is it, up and comings or whatever they call it, are going to get their medicine. And we have to be confident of that. As Gentiles, we have to understand that what you're being told in the media is not really the truth. You know, that's it's very easy to point the finger at Israel, but you know, anyone with a modicum of common sense is going to say, well, hang on a minute, there's got to be two sides to this story, hasn't there? And history repeats itself, doesn't it? So some of these psalms are very, very moving in as much that, you know, you've got to read them more than once. And some of the things you have to put it down and just absorb it a little bit and then come back to it. And you may want to do that with these videos also. Just, you know, might be a bit much all in one go. Sit down with your copy of Psalms, and although there might be slight differences in grammar or what have you, but if you're using the copy I do, you will have the same explanations for each verse, and that will help you. You can go back now and read that psalm and then reread each comment for each psalm and get added inspiration and insight from it. So I'm just introducing it to you. Your job's to take it further and go back and read the psalm and then read the explanations that are in your edition. And it just gives you a whole different vista opens up. You know, like, for instance, how many of you knew that the fingers, that they damaged their fingers so that they couldn't play, you know? They're little things that you don't always come upon. So when I say the Psalms have lots of little hidden gems, they certainly do. In the meantime, please take care and God bless.